The morning my life changed, I was sitting in a window booth at Harlow's, the kind of upscale brunch spot where the mimosas cost $14 and the hostess remembers your name. My husband was there, my best friend was there, and for a few minutes, I actually believed I was happy. My husband, I'll call him Victor because that's what he always wanted to be, the Victor in every room he walked into, had just excused himself to take a phone call. That was nothing new. Victor always had calls to take, deals to close, people who needed him more urgently than I did. My best friend Diane slid into the seat across from me and started talking about her sister's upcoming baby shower, and I was nodding along, stirring my coffee, watching the Sunday morning crowd drift past the windows. That's when I noticed him. He was older, maybe late 60s, with a gray wool coat that looked too warm for the season. He was sitting alone 2 tables away, and he was watching me. Not in a creepy way, in a deliberate way, like someone who had been waiting for a specific moment and recognized it when it arrived. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. He gave me the smallest nod, then stood up slowly. I looked toward the door where Victor had disappeared. Still gone. I looked at Diane. She was checking her phone. The man walked to our table and set something down beside my coffee cup without a word. A small padded envelope, the kind used for mailing USB drives or jewelry, folded over and sealed with a single strip of tape. He leaned down slightly and in a low voice said, "Don't let anyone see you open this, and don't go home alone tonight." Then he walked straight out the front door. I sat completely still. The envelope was the size of my palm. Diane looked up from her phone. "Who was that?" "I don't know," I said, which was the truth. "I think he had the wrong table." I slipped the envelope into my purse just as Victor came back, sliding into his seat with the easy confidence of a man who has never once doubted his own welcome. He kissed my cheek and asked if I'd ordered yet. I smiled and said, "Not yet." My hand was shaking under the table. "My name is Mara." I was 31 years old that Sunday morning, 2 years into a marriage I had believed in completely, living in a house in Scottsdale that Victor had picked out and furnished mostly without me, in a neighborhood full of people whose names I was still learning. I had moved from Portland for him. I had left my job at an architecture firm for him, just temporarily, he'd said, until we get settled. We had been settled for 18 months and I still wasn't working. I didn't open the envelope at the restaurant. I didn't open it in the car, even though it sat in my purse like a stone the entire drive home. Victor talked the whole way. Something about a land deal in Tempe, a contractor who was causing problems, a city permit that was taking too long. I made sounds of agreement at the right intervals. I watched his hands on the steering wheel. They were relaxed. I opened the envelope that evening while Victor was downstairs watching football with his brother Frank. Frank. I need to tell you about Frank, because you'll need to understand who I thought he was before you can understand who he turned out to be. Frank was Victor's older brother by 7 years. He was quiet, where Victor was loud, careful where Victor was reckless, and he had always been polite to me in the specific way that people are polite when they are keeping their distance on purpose. I had chalked it up to personality. Some people just aren't warm. I had never once suspected that Frank's distance from me was actually a form of protection, his own, and eventually mine. But I didn't know that yet. That evening, Frank was just Victor's brother sitting on my couch, and I was upstairs in my walk-in closet with the door closed, sitting on the floor with the padded envelope in my lap. Inside was a USB drive and a single index card. The handwriting was small and precise. "Everything on this drive is real. His business partner is named Cole. The property on Dunbar Road is not what they told the investors. A woman named Patricia filed a complaint in March. It was dismissed. Find her." I turned the card over. Nothing on the back. I didn't have a laptop in the bedroom. Victor had always kept our computers in the shared office downstairs, which I had never thought about until that exact moment, when I realized I couldn't use any of them. I sat on the closet floor for a long time. The man at the restaurant had told me not to go home alone. I had come home anyway because where else would I go, and because I had told myself I was being dramatic. Sitting on that floor, I stopped telling myself that. The next morning, I waited until Victor left for the office. Then I drove to the public library on Camelback Road and used one of their computers. "I want to tell you what I found," But I need you to understand first that I spent approximately 45 minutes convincing myself there was an innocent explanation for all of it. That's how much I had loved him. That's how completely I had reorganized my entire life around a version of Victor that, as it turned out, had been constructed specifically for my benefit. The USB contained 3 folders. The first had financial documents, wire transfers, shell company registrations, LLC filings. The company names meant nothing to me initially. The second folder had photographs, aerial shots of a property out in the desert east of the city, a lot of surveying stakes, and what looked like the beginning of a drainage system. The third folder had a single video file, 11 minutes long, shot on what looked like a phone camera in a parking garage. I watched the video twice. It showed Victor and a man I didn't recognize, who I would later learn was Cole Merritt, his business partner of 4 years, standing beside a black SUV, talking. The audio was poor but audible. They were talking about a woman named Patricia Voss who had started asking the wrong questions. Victor said very clearly that she needed to be handled before the county meeting. Cole said he had someone who could talk to her. Victor said talking wasn't going to be enough. Then the footage cut out. I sat in that library chair and stared at the screen for a long time. Patricia Voss was not hard to find. She had a LinkedIn profile. She was a licensed civil engineer based in Mesa, and there was a brief mention in a local news archive from April about a zoning complaint she had filed regarding a development project on Dunbar Road that was later withdrawn. The article said the complaint had been withdrawn voluntarily. It said nothing about why. I found her phone number through a professional directory. I called from the library's courtesy phone and left a message saying I had information about Dunbar Road and that I was not connected to the development company. I left my cell number and hung up. She called me back in 40 minutes. Patricia Voss spoke quickly and quietly, like someone who had decided at some point to be afraid and hadn't stopped since. She told me she had spent 4 months documenting discrepancies between the permitted plans for the Dunbar Road development and what was actually being built. The project was supposed to be a mixed-use residential complex, the actual structure being built underground, and she emphasized underground because the above-ground framing looked legitimate, was something else. She had taken her findings to the county. 2 weeks after filing, she had received a visit at her home from 2 men she didn't recognize, who didn't threaten her explicitly, but made clear that her 14-year-old daughter took the same bus route every day. She withdrew the complaint the next morning. "I have copies of everything," she said. "I've had them in a safety deposit box for 6 months because I didn't know who to trust." I told her I might know someone who could help. I didn't know yet if that was true. "I need to tell you about my father-in-law, Gerald." I had always thought of Gerald as Victor's father, the way you think of a piece of furniture in someone else's house. Present, functional, not particularly relevant to you. He was 71, recently widowed, and he lived in a retirement community in Chandler. He called Victor every Sunday, and Victor usually let it go to voicemail. What I didn't know, what Victor had been careful to ensure I didn't know, was that Gerald had spent 30 years as a forensic accountant before he retired. And what Gerald had known for approximately 8 months, as he told me when I drove to Chandler the following Tuesday and sat across from him in his small, neat living room, was that his son was running a fraudulent investment scheme using the Dunbar Road project as the vehicle. "I found out because he needed my help with something," Gerald said. He had the hands of someone who had spent decades holding a pen, careful, deliberate hands. He wanted me to co-sign a document. When I read it, I understood what it was. I told him no. He stopped returning my calls. "Why didn't you go to the FBI?" I asked. Gerald looked at me for a moment. "Because he's my son," he said. I kept thinking he would stop, that he would find a way out. I was wrong to wait. I know that. He paused. "I'm not wrong anymore." The man from the restaurant, I later learned, was Gerald's oldest friend, a retired detective named Hal who had done Gerald a favor, because Gerald himself was too recognizable. Victor would have spotted his own father. He wouldn't have known how. Over the next 3 weeks, Gerald and I built a case. Patricia came in from Mesa with her safety deposit box documents. Hal connected us with an FBI contact he had trusted for years, an agent named Reeves. which is the only name in this story you'll hear me use carefully, because she was careful about everything and it mattered. Gerald translated the financial documents into language that meant something to federal investigators. I provided the USB contents and a 6-month record of Victor's schedule that I had been keeping in the Notes app of my phone without knowing why. Dates, times, who he met, what properties he mentioned, which calls he stepped outside to take. Victor noticed nothing. That was the thing that stayed with me through all of it. How unobservant he was about me, specifically. He had married me, I came to understand, because I was calm and undemanding and decorative, and had shown no particular inclination toward curiosity about his work. I had been, in his assessment, safe. He had not been wrong about me. He had just failed to account for what I might become when given a reason. Frank knew. That was the part I hadn't seen coming. 3 weeks into my quiet investigation, Frank showed up at my door on a Wednesday afternoon when Victor was in Tempe. He stood on my doorstep and said, without preamble, "I know what you're doing. I've known for about 10 days. I'm not going to stop you." I didn't say anything. I stood very still. "I want you to know," Frank said, "that I knew something was wrong 2 years ago. I didn't know the extent of it. I told myself it wasn't my business." He looked at the ground, then back at me. "It became my business when he told me what they did to that engineer. To Patricia. I should have moved sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." Frank had his own documentation, phone records between Victor and Cole. Text messages Frank had screenshotted over the past year without knowing exactly what he was going to do with them. He handed me a folder and walked back to his car. I stood in the doorway holding the folder, and I thought about the years I had chalked Frank's silence up to coldness. How many people around us are not cold, just frightened, just waiting for someone else to move first? The morning of the federal coordinated action, I was not at home. Agent Reeves had been clear about this. I needed to be somewhere documented, somewhere with witnesses, somewhere that established my position unambiguously. I was at my mother's house in Tempe, where I had told Victor I was going to help her with some furniture rearranging. My mother knew only that I needed to be there and that I would explain later. She made coffee, and we watched a home renovation show, and at 11:47 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Gerald. "It's done," he said. "They have both of them." Victor and Cole were taken into federal custody that morning on charges including wire fraud, investment fraud, and witness intimidation related to Patricia Voss. The Dunbar Road property was seized. The investors, 41 individuals and 3 small business entities who had put money into what they believed was a legitimate residential development, were notified. The total fraudulent investment amount was documented at $4.3 million. I filed for divorce 11 days later. I want to tell you what the aftermath looked like because I think people always want to know about aftermath, and because I think they deserve to hear the honest version rather than the clean one. The honest version is that I sat in my car in the parking lot of my divorce attorney's office and cried for 40 minutes before our first meeting, not because I still loved Victor, but because of the specific grief of realizing that you had been chosen as a prop in someone else's story, that the life you thought you were building was a set, that the man who kissed you good morning was performing a role he had cast himself in, and you had not been a character, you had been a backdrop. The honest version is that it was Gerald who called me most often in the months that followed. Not to talk about Victor, but to talk about other things. A book he was reading, a bird he'd identified in his courtyard, the granddaughter of a neighbor who reminded him of someone. Gerald had lost his son, functionally, and I had lost my marriage, and we were both people who had been living adjacent to a deception for longer than we'd known, and somehow that made us the same kind of tired. Patricia Voss and I had coffee in February, 4 months after the arrests. She looked better than she had sounded on the phone, less frightened, more solid, like someone who had been waiting a long time to put her feet back on the ground. Her complaint was formally reinstated by the county. The Dunbar Road site was under a new investigation for environmental violations. She was working again. "I almost didn't call you back," she told me. "When you left that message, I almost deleted it." "I almost didn't call," I said. She nodded. We understood each other. Frank testified at the grand jury proceedings and was granted immunity for his cooperation. He moved to Colorado in January. He sent me a text on my birthday that said simply, "I hope this year is better. You deserved better from the start." It was the most he had ever said to me in 3 years of knowing him, and it was enough. The investors' recovery process was slow. Not all of them got everything back. Some of them had put in retirement savings. One couple had pulled equity from their home. I read their impact statements in a courthouse hallway where I was waiting to give my own deposition, and I thought about how a single person's choice to treat other people as instruments ripples outward in ways they never account for and never see. Victor, in the end, pled guilty to avoid trial. He received 7 years. His lawyer argued for less. The judge declined. At the sentencing, I sat 3 rows behind the investors and their families. I wasn't there for Victor. I was there for them and for Patricia, and in some way for myself, for the woman who had sat in a library on a Tuesday morning watching a grainy parking garage video and had decided in the silence after it ended that she was done being a backdrop. On my way out of the courthouse, Gerald was waiting by the door. He had dressed carefully, the way people dress for things that matter. We walked to the parking lot together and didn't say much, and at his car he said, "Hal wanted me to tell you something." I looked at him. He said he knew it when he sat down across from you at the restaurant. He said he could tell. "Tell what?" I asked. Gerald smiled, just slightly, that you were the kind of person who would actually look inside the envelope. I drove home thinking about that. About all the times in my life I had not looked inside envelopes, the things I had left sealed because opening them was frightening, because knowing meant deciding, because staying in comfortable uncertainty felt safer than stepping into difficult truth. I had spent 2 years in a house that looked like a life and felt like a waiting room, and I had told myself that was normal, that marriages take time, that I just needed to be patient. I live in Portland again now. I have a job at a small firm that does residential renovations, adaptive reuse projects, mostly old buildings made into something they weren't before but that fit what's needed now. My manager says I have a good instinct for seeing what a structure can become rather than just what it is. I think about that man in the gray wool coat sometimes, about how he sat in that restaurant watching the door, waiting for exactly the right moment, betting everything on a stranger he'd never met being worth the risk. I think about the envelope on the table. I think about the fact that sometimes the most important thing that will ever happen to you arrives with no explanation, no guarantee, and no promise that anything that follows will be easy. You just have to be the kind of person who opens it,